Once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have a very special guest, Ann B. Gass. She is here to talk tonight about her new book, We Demand: The Suffrage Road Trip. This is going to be really interesting. We had her here last year, and she talked a lot about her great-grandmother's experience and gaining voting rights in Maine. Let me tell you a little bit about Ann. So Ann B. Gass is an independent historian with a passion for sharing the history of women's fight for voting and other rights. Not surprisingly, as I mentioned, she was descended from a suffragist. She published Voting Down the Rows, Florence Brooke Whitehouse and Maine's Fight for Women's Suffrage, and a thoroughly researched account of her great-grandmother's leadership in the decisive final years of the suffrage battle. Gass lectures on women's suffrage and women's rights history at schools, colleges, museums, historical societies, and other venues. In fact, right before this, we were just talking about she had a very robust schedule with the senior colleges during this pandemic.
Yeah.
She's in women's history groups and women's rights groups in Maine and nationally, and we are just, again, very lucky to have her here tonight. So I'd love to turn the program over to Ann Gass. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks so much for organizing this, and to Camden Public Library for hosting, and to all of you for joining us on this incredibly beautiful evening. What a nice start to the summer this is. So We Demand: The Suffrage Road Trip is a historical novel. It's fiction. It's based, though, on the true story of an epic journey that took place in 1915. And I'm going to share my screen now and give a shout out to my daughter, Emma Levitt, who was the artist who did the illustrations for both the cover and the chapters there. So you should be able to see that. I'll have another photo of the cover a little bit later. But so this trip in 1915 wasn't the first ever cross-country road trip undertaken by women in an automobile. And it wasn't, certainly wasn't the first ever undertaken by car at all. But it's notable for being the first one ever undertaken for a cause, and that cause was voting rights for women, or women's suffrage. Very briefly on the background of it is that these four women are charged. They're kind of launched from San Francisco's Panama-Pacific International Exposition in September of 1915. And their mission is they're supposed to drive across the country, kind of rallying the troops and demanding an amendment to the United States Constitution and franchising women. They're supposed to arrive in DC on December 6th. It's challenging because they don't leave San Francisco until late September, and they're going across country, taking a little bit more of a northern route, and it's hot at first, but it's going to get cold. And just a quick, pointing out that the reason why the petitions are so important to this story is that there are no polls in 1915. The petitions are the way that women can prove that they want the right to vote. So it's a big deal, and they claim when they leave San Francisco that they have 500,000 signatures on this petition, which is a lot. So they're quite excited about that. So, just by way of quick background, and if you don't know this history well, in 1915, the US Constitution only really recognized men's voting rights, white men and black men, but only men. And it had been a long time, 126 years from the Constitution's adoption. And if you're familiar with the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, it had been already 67 years since that convention, where they first, in a really organized way, demanded the right to vote. And they were closer. A lot of states had enfranchised women through state action, but they were still a long way from being in the Constitution. And some of them were getting pretty frustrated by that, because the thing is that they had no idea how much longer it was going to take. Is it, were they going to get the vote in 5 years, 10 years, another 67 years? Nobody knew. And a lot of women came to suffrage. That wasn't their first love in a way, in terms of a cause. They came to suffrage from temperance or social work or peace work. And they were sick of working on suffrage. They want to get back to their other causes. So the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, or the CU, was a kind of an upstart organization. It had only been formed a couple of years before by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and some others. And whereas the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was kind of the legacy organization, had been around for decades, and their focus had been really on winning suffrage state by state, kind of a states' right route to suffrage. But in contrast, the Congressional Unions decided right from the start, they were focused on a federal amendment to the Constitution enfranchising women. And one of the strategies they were planning to use was to punish the political party in power for failing to move the suffrage amendment through Congress. And in 1915, that was the Democrats, because as you may recall from your history classes, President Woodrow Wilson had been elected in 1912, and the Democrats had both houses of Congress. And so they'd been stalling on this, for years and years, long before Wilson got into office. But, they had certainly been stalling on it during his presidency. So this trip, in a way, is a big threat from the Congressional Union to the Democratic members of Congress. And they kind of started this in 1914, where they sent organizers out to the states that had enfranchised women through state action, which were all west of the Mississippi. It turned out, all these white states here. And they basically told people, look, we don't care who you vote for. And in 1915, there were more choices than just Republicans or Democrats. They said, just make sure you don't vote for the Democrats, because we need to punish them for not moving this through Congress. So that's kind of what this trip is all about, is marshaling the troops to get behind this concept, because we have a presidential election coming up in 1916, and they're going to go after Wilson and the Democrats there. This is kind of a famous illustration of this concept. And they're enlisting the votes of the women voters of the West who can, vote for Congress or the presidents, and asking them to vote against the Democrats. And a couple interesting things about this slide is you can see, what does this woman look like? She's young. She looks like a goddess. I mean, she's like a Greek goddess or something. She's looks smart and well educated. This wasn't an accident. This is very much the image that the Congressional Union was trying to project about who is this woman voter? What will she be like? I mean, she's not some, African American. She's not an immigrant. She's young. She's smart, and the country needs women like her in the voting rolls, and that's kind of what they're trying to portray. And it's just, I love this slide too, because it shows that the women in the East who don't have the vote are kind of mired in this black pit of despair. So the woman voter of the West is coming across the country to the aid of her benighted Eastern sisters. So I mentioned earlier that they launched this expedition from the Panama-Pacific International Exposition, which was held in 1915 in San Francisco. And the Congressional Union had a booth there. And they came up with this great scheme of they would collect signatures on this petition throughout the period that the fair was open, because they knew that millions and millions of people were planning to come to the fair. So they thought it would be easy, it would be good place to pick up a lot of signatures. And that's where they got the 500,000. And this is a little picture of their booth. It's a little hard to see, but I had to blow it up from a very tiny postage stamp photo. Anyway, and then the other part of the scheme is in September, they're going to hold this first ever in the world convention of women voters. And so they send out in the spring and summer, they send out organizers to all those Western voting states and tell them, send delegates to San Francisco, because we're going to choose these suffrage envoys, they called them, who are going to drive across the country and take this message to Congress and the president. And at one point, you start seeing, this is actually the front cover of the Suffragist, which was the Congressional Union's weekly newspaper, advertising this upcoming convention. And they, in the spring of 1915, in the Suffragist, you start seeing these articles where like, oh, this is going to be so great. We're going to have 100 cars go across the country. And everybody was really excited about this strategy. But the problem was nobody volunteered. No one volunteered at all until into the Congressional Union's booth at the Panama-Pacific one day in the summer, in August, wander these two middle-aged Swedish immigrants, Ingeborg Kindstedt and Maria Ginberg. It's Ingeborg on the left and Maria on the right. And they say, we live in Rhode Island and we are, we're concerned about suffrage. We're interested in it. And they actually had started their own little suffrage organization in Providence. And they said, we took a boat out here intending to buy a car and drive it back across the country and do some sightseeing. So we'll take the petitions with us. But they had no idea, I think, what they were really getting into. Because what the CU had in mind was this mad dash across the country where they would stop in every city and town and give speeches and get people excited about the federal amendment. And it was the fall, so Congress wasn't in session and the Congress members were back in their districts. So they would be leading delegations of women to meet with a congressman and demand that they pass the suffrage amendment. So, I mean, this is a very different kind of plan from having a leisurely drive across the country, stopping to see what you might along the way. And I think there was a bit of a communication issue there. But this is Ingeborg. And you can see this is the car that they drove. And here's an example of what they called the We Demand banner. We demand an amendment to the United States Constitution enfranchising women. And you can see she doesn't look quite like that woman voter of the West, does she? I mean, she's older. She's wearing, serviceable, practical clothes, but they aren't in the first style. And she spoke English with a funny accent. And so they didn't want her or Maria. And the Congressional Union told them, you can't speak on this trip across the country. You're, and their rationale was, you're not from an equal voting state, so you can't speak on behalf of them. I think that was a little bit of a specious argument there. But they did initially especially make this real distinction between the driver and the mechanic, and Ingeborg was the mechanic, actually. Maria was the driver, and the envoys, who were these two other women I'll introduce in a moment. So here's Maria Ginberg. So Ingeborg was 50 when this trip took place. Maria was 55. And so neither one of them had a particularly easy life. Ingeborg actually was a radical. She was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World. She had her own business helping to do background checks on Swedish immigrants who lived in, came to Providence and needed a reference in order to get a job, and especially in domestic work, like a maid or something like that. But Maria was a midwife, and she had her own midwifery practice, and they had lived together since the mid 1890s. And so about 20 years by the time they went on this trip. Sarah Bardfield was the envoy. She ends up being the primary envoy, which I'll, for reasons I'll share in a moment. But she was 34 or so at the time of this trip. She didn't know how to drive a car or fix one, but she had done some other suffrage work, and she was pretty good on the stump. So they wanted her to do this trip. She was kind of a hot mess at the time of this trip. She was living in San Francisco and just pining away for her lover, who was 30 years older than her and lived with his wife and children in Portland, Oregon. He was, his name was Charles Erskine Scott Wood, and he was a serial philanderer. He had he had girlfriends and mistresses, throughout his marriage, and his wife was Catholic, so she didn't want to divorce him. But he also had other mistresses besides Sarah while he was seeing Sarah. But they lived kind of far apart, so that's in some ways not surprising. But she'd had malaria and the summer before the trip and wasn't well. She had problems with her heart. She'd fainted at one point. So she's kind of a weak link on the way there, but way across the country. The one thing that Sarah did on this trip, I mean, she did give a lot of great speeches. I want to give her that credit. But she also wrote these voluminous letters to Erskine, describing the trip. And so that's one of the reasons why we know quite a bit about it, but it's all from her point of view because the Swedes didn't write letters like that. And then here's the other envoy is Frances Joliffe, who actually made it one stop. She made it from San Francisco to Sacramento, and then she dropped out of the trip. She didn't rejoin them until New York, Albany, New York. And so what was interesting was they wanted her, the CU had wanted her on this trip because she was more of a wealthy socialite, where Sarah and certainly the Swedish women come from more working class backgrounds. Frances had grown up in a more affluent, community. She was well connected politically in San Francisco, and she had done a lot of fundraising for President Wilson in 1912. So they wanted her on the trip because they thought she'd be good at fundraising and that she would help them fundraise on their way across the country. And then Mabel Vernon was their advance organizer. She was a single woman from Delaware, and she was just amazing. I mean, she was such a hard worker and relentless, just very much in the Alice Paul vein as well. You might have heard stories about Alice's too. And she kept them hopping. Her job was to take a train ahead of them and sort of hopscotch across the country ahead of the envoys and set up these rallies and these delegations to congressmen, so that when they showed up in town, there was some event planned for them usually. And here's the car that they drove across the country. It was an Overland 6, and built by the Willis Overland Company. The Willis Overland Company they were based in Dayton, Ohio, and they had dropped their price substantially and done a ton of advertising in both Swedish and in English language newspapers. They had this special price for this car just at the Panama-Pacific, and that might be why they ended up with it. In the book, I have Maria and Ingeborg name her for a Swedish suffragist whose name was Amelia Ratu, and so they call her Amelia. But you can see, she's a nice shiny car. She's got places to strap on their luggage, but she has no top. There is a bit of a roll-up top, but it doesn't. It sort of traps the fumes, keeps the rain out and some of the wind, but it traps the fumes and rattles quite a bit. So they run with it down most of the time. No heat or air conditioning, of course. So no GPS. So it's a bit of a challenge to get across the country in Amelia. And this is the route that they're going to take. They're going to take what was called then the Lincoln Highway. It was this brand new concept of a coast-to-coast highway in the U.S. Hadn't existed before, and it didn't really exist in actuality on the ground. A lot of times it was this sort of glorified cart track. But it went from San Francisco, and they followed it. This sort of dark line is where the Lincoln Highway actually went, and the red line is where the suffrage envoys kind of where they departed and returned to it. So they end up coming across through Nebraska into Illinois. They hop up to Detroit, and then come back and up around to New York, and then down the eastern seaboard to DC. That's the plan. Of course, they left San Francisco without a map, so that made things a bit challenging for them in some areas. So here they are in Salt Lake City, and they've just driven through hundreds of miles of desert. I don't know if anybody's traveled in Nevada, in the eastern part of Nevada through the Great Basin. But I actually followed their route in 2015, 100 years later. And I'm here to tell you, those women were tough. I mean, I also had a brand new car. Mine had air conditioning and heat, and there were much better roads, and it was still a very tiring trip. And I just don't know how they did it. But here they are. This is an example of what an event looked like for them. So in Utah, interestingly, the suffragists, the women had suffrage there for a much longer time. They'd actually gotten it, then it was taken away from them, and then they regained it when Utah became a state. So they got a good turnout there. And here they are in Colorado Springs. And you can see, at this point, they've been on the road for weeks. And don't they look happy? I love this photograph. This is Sarah and Ingeborg and Maria. And then Bertha Fowler, who was the chair of the the Colorado branch of the Congressional Union, is with them in the car. And this is the way the We Demand banner, this is the way they would sort of dress the car up with it when they arrived in town. I don't know if you've ever done a long trip with somebody, but even when you love them, it can be tiring, and you can, your nerves can get frayed. And it looks to me like that's exactly what's happening here. Part of the reason too is that they got no breaks. They got very few days off. There was just constant, and it was just really tiring. And the roads aren't good along the way, as I mentioned. Here's one example. This is not their car, it's not from their trip, but I took this photograph from a historical, sort of history museum or someplace like that I stopped in on my way across the country. And you can see this is exactly the kind of thing that they would have been dealing with. And from the book, this is a description of this. They actually do get stuck in the mud in Kansas. And this is how I describe it in the book. The mud was the real worry, though. In some sections, it came halfway up Amelia's tires, and she had to plunge through one hole after another. Maria clung to the steering wheel, grim-faced, as Amelia churned along, slipping and sliding. They rode silently, listening to the sound of the engine laboring, all of them fluent now in the language of pistons and sparks, and alert to any sign of distress. No one else was traveling this late at night, and aside from the occasional farmhouse, they were utterly alone. Without warning, Amelia's nose dropped, and there was a sickening slide into deep muck. Her engine wailed as Maria tried first to jam forward through the mud hole and then to reverse backward over the lip they'd just come down. No luck. After a death rattle, Amelia quit for good. Water began seeping through the floorboards as Maria ground on the starter, but the engine wouldn't catch. So here they are, it's 10 o'clock at night. They're out in the middle of these cornfields. Can't see hardly, they barely see any houses. In the end, Sarah has to walk back 2 miles. It's funny, it goes, their description of how long she had to walk was 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles in either knee deep or waist deep mud, depending on which account you hear or read. But she does have to walk quite a ways back to wake up a farmer, get him to hitch up his team to the plow, to the wagon rather, and come pull them out of the mud hole. So that's just one example of the adventures that they were, kind of came up against on their way across the country. Do they make it to DC on the appointed day and time? You're going to have to read the book to find that out. But I just want to talk a little bit more about this trip and kind of what it meant for me and how I thought about it, what I learned from it. I learned about this trip in the course of writing that first book that Julia mentioned, Voting Down the Rose, Florence Brooks White House and Maine's Fight for Women's Suffrage, which was about my great-grandmother. And, I read a lot in getting that book pulled together, and I kept coming across descriptions of this 1915 trip, and I kept thinking, that must have been one hell of a trip. I'd really like to research that one day, and I finally, in 2015, found the chance to do it. But, even though they mention the trip, sometimes these histories don't even mention Ingeborg and Maria at all, or when they do, they always paint Ingeborg in this very unflattering light. She's said to be kind of, ill-tempered and irritable, and jealous of Sarah, and just all of these different things. And it's a very one-sided presentation because people get that information from Sarah's letters to Erskine. And it's been really interesting to me, since this book's only been out a couple months now, but it's been really interesting to talk to people who've read it, and they love Ingeborg and Maria, and they really don't think highly of Sarah. So clearly it matters who tells the story and who gets to paint the picture. So for me, that's been kind of interesting. And then, I came across this quote from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who's a novelist, a Nigerian novelist, and she warns of the danger of the single story and says, the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And until about the last 5 years or so, the single story that had been told about the suffrage movement was from the perspective of white middle-class women like Sarah. It was incomplete. But thanks to pushback and research from people of color and their allies, we're beginning to have a much richer and more nuanced understanding of the US suffrage movement. So in 2015, as I mentioned, I spent 8 weeks following their route across the country. And the question kept coming up. I mean, whose history was this? Was this a history about Black people and Black suffragists? No, it was not. Was it a history of Hispanic or Asian Americans suffragists? No, it was not, because they were not welcome on the platform. They didn't look like that young woman voter of the illustration that I showed you earlier. It certainly wasn't a story about Native Americans, because they weren't even recognized as US citizens until 1924. So they sure weren't on the platform. And not really labor and working class women either. There was a lot of lip service given to the women, working in factories and stuff, but that's not who was talking. So that all pushed me to tell another version of the story. And ultimately I wrote it as a novel, because it was the only way that I could kind of get into the heads of Ingeborg and Maria. They simply didn't leave much of a record behind. They weren't writing those long letters like Sarah's, and they weren't allowed to speak, so they weren't even covered that much in the newspapers. There's only one interview I found where Ingeborg is quoted. And writing it as a novel still allowed me to pay tribute to the grit and determination of the women who made the trip, and the marvelous story that resulted from it. And so I wove together fact and fiction, and used their trip as kind of the training wheels for writing the novel, which was a new experience for me. I'd never done that before. But I had, as I said, to kind of create the characters of Maria and Ingeborg, kind of using the little bit of information that I had about them. Here's some examples of how I did that. We know from the census that they had been living together from, the mid 1890s. So I made them romantic partners, lesbians. There's no documentation that was the case, but certainly Boston marriages, which were those, supposedly asexual relationships where women simply pooled their resources and lived together, those were quite common in the early 20th century. So it may have just have been that, but there was definitely a queer element in the suffrage movement. So I thought it wasn't much of a stretch to do that. But it was a secret that they shared with very few people. And as I said earlier, Sarah and Mabel both describe Ingeborg as irritable. Sarah in her letters, and then both Sarah and Mabel in the 1960s did these very long oral histories with Amelia Fry. And again, I mean, the Swedes don't come off too well in those interviews. So I chose to reframe Ingeborg's irritability as justified. I mean, even during the trip, she and Maria were erased from the story. There were times when the newspapers didn't mention them being in the car at all, yet they would mention Frances Joliffe as being on the trip, even though she hadn't been with them for weeks. She left in Sacramento. So that would have made me kind of bitter and cranky. And it might even make me, I don't know, want to send Swedish language news releases, press releases to Swedish language newspapers, of which there were like 650 around this time, talking about the trip, but not mentioning the envoys, you know, Sarah and Frances, but just mentioning Ingeborg and Maria. And that's, somebody does this. I mean, I actually was able to track down a handful of Swedish newspapers, and I don't read Swedish, but their names are unmistakable, so I could spot them. And then I found a translator to translate the articles, and this is an example of one of them. I just makes me hoot. Well, who's featured in it? Miss Ingeborg Kindstedt is out traveling in a petition car across the continent on the suffragettes' behalf. And she departed from San Francisco. She's with her girlfriend, Miss Ginberg, who bought the automobile in which they're traveling. They're bringing with them this petition. No mention of Sarah whatsoever anywhere in this article, which I just think is hysterical. And anyway, I do weave that into the story of the book. And but I also, she was 50 years old at the time of the trip. And when I was 50, I was, going through menopause, and that made me a little cranky. You get those hot flashes and, at inopportune moments, and you don't sleep well at night. I mean, that would make me cranky too. So, we joke about menopause, but that's a real thing. So that's in the book too. These are kind of unlikely suffrage heroines, and I just wanted to paint a different picture of them. There's no record of Ingeborg Maria having had sort of side meetings with anybody else on the trip. It could have happened, I don't know. So I imagine that it did. And one of the things that happened was that Joe Hill, who was a radical, like Ingeborg, also a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, and he actually was in prison, in the Sugar House prison in Salt Lake City when they came through there. He was just weeks away from being executed for a murder that he almost certainly didn't do. I mean, he was probably framed for it just so that they could get rid of him. So I have her go and visit Joe Hill and highlight, his story. I think she was certainly aware of him. She had to have been because she was literate and she was reading newspapers, and the Swedish language press would have covered this, I'm certain. The other person that they go to see is Ida B. Wells, who was a Black suffragist and journalist and anti-lynching activist who was from the South but lived in Chicago. And again, you never see or hear about any Black women on this trip of theirs in 1915. And so I confront that head on in the story, and they go to see Ida and talk to her about it. The other person that they go to see, another person, is Clarence Darrow, who was kind of the darling of the labor movement during that period. Interestingly, he and Sarah's older sister, Mary, had been lovers for a number of years. So Sarah actually knew him, and he also lived in Chicago. So I have them meet up with Clarence and talk about a few things along the way. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the cover and our concept here. But before I do that, I'm just going to mention that the book includes an afterword where I try to separate the fact from the fiction of the story. I'm finding that as more time goes on, I'm starting to forget what I made up and what I actually researched, because I did thoroughly research this trip, as I said, I mean, including going on it, but reading about it. I flew out to the Huntington Library in Pasadena, where Sarah's letters are, and read all of those. So, I mean, I know a lot about this trip, and I kind of wove into the story a lot of the facts of it, but I tried to separate them out in the afterword. When I did my trip in 2015, Donald Trump hadn't yet been nominated for the presidency, and yet he later became the nominee and became president, of course. But at that time, there was a lot of excitement about Hillary Clinton possibly being the first woman president of the U.S. And on my way across the country, I was meeting with leagues of women voters and women's rights activists to try to understand what difference having had the vote had meant to women in the preceding 100 years. So I was very aware of the excitement about Hillary's candidacy, and certainly shared in everybody's anger and concern when Trump became president, because my research was showing me that the U.S. in 1915 was an awful lot like the U.S. in 2015. There was a ton of institutionalized misogyny and racism and anti-immigrant sentiment. And I found that kind of frightening. So a lot of that ends up in the story as well. And I do want to talk about these petitions because they're such an important part of the story. And for me, they're such a potent symbol of how long and hard women had to work in order to win voting rights, and of how uncertain the future of the movement was for these suffragettes in 1915. I mean, they had no idea how long it was going to take. And the petitions also remind us that, as frustrating as it must have been for them to put all that work into collecting signatures only to be blown off by yet another state legislature or by yet another Congress, their work was always peaceful. They never broke any windows. They didn't break into the Capitol building like it happened on the January 6th. The women were always peaceful and strong. And so at one point I have Ingeborg reflect on the petitions, and I have her, it occurred to her that the pages of all the many petitions gathered over decades from white women and colored, from Eastern or Western states, by Susan B. Anthony and countless others, would stretch for hundreds of miles, and every page would have carried the hopes and dreams of both the signers and the collectors. What a wretched waste of time it all had been, she thought, suddenly angry. Surely the generations of women who had worked so hard to reach this moment could have set their hands to some better purpose. How many more petitions would be required to end this one battle? And so the petitions you can see on the cover weave through different groups of women over time and ultimately become the road under the wheels of Amelia in the illustration that Emma designed for the cover. So this book is about a journey on many levels. It's, the amazing highs and lows of the 1915 trip itself, the journey that the suffrage movement took to where it was in 1915, and the journeys the individual participants took, how it changed them. And it did change them in ways that I talk about in the book. And then finally, this is not my story personally, it does reflect my own journey, which I'm still on, in understanding this history and its connections to the present. So I just want to finish up here with sharing with you the 19th Amendment. This is the language of what eventually got through Congress and was ratified by the necessary 36 states by August of 2020. I think it was 132 years from the time that the Constitution was first signed to get this language into the Constitution. It remains the only constitutionally protected right that women have. Every other right that we have has been won by statute or regulation or executive order, and so we're more vulnerable than we ought to be. And I always love this quote by Alice Paul. I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality. And that's where we are today, because women, are still not equal in the Constitution. The Equal Rights Amendment has never been finished, that work. Just in the last 3 years, the last 3 states needed to ratify have been found. They've ratified, but there's more stuff that has to happen because Congress had imposed a time limit back in 1972, and then they extended it in 1982, I think, or in 1979. So, they have to find a way to get that through the House and the Senate. And the House has already passed a bill that would remove the time limit. It's stuck in the Senate for reasons I probably don't have to explain to you. So here's some information about me, and you can find me on my website. This Suffrage Road Trip blogspot.com is where I blogged about that 1915 road trip. And you can learn more about Florence on her website. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And we do have such a lovely small number of people here that I'd be happy to just open it up and have people shout out questions. We can have a discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anne. I certainly do invite people, if you would like me to unmute you, just go ahead and type it in the chat box, and I'm happy to do so. Or if you choose that you would just like to submit your questions through the chat box, you're welcome to do that as well. While folks are thinking of their questions, I wanted to start out again, Anne, by thanking you for doing the work that you do, for writing the books that you do, and for doing programs like this to continue to help tell these stories. Because as you said, they are still extraordinarily relevant. So again, thank you. The first thing I wanted to ask was about Mabel Vernon, and was she doing any kind of organizing of security ahead, to coincide with these events happening in the different towns that they were planning stops at? I'm thinking about this happening and wondering how they were received in each of the towns.
They didn't worry about security. Usually there was a military band. She would try to find a military band to kind of precede their entourage kind of from the outskirts of a city into wherever the rally was going to take place. Usually what would happen, if it was a big enough town, they didn't do it in the smaller ones, but usually what would happen is they would, meet at some, on the outskirts of town or a mile or so from the city center. And then they would be met by other automobiles driven by suffragists, and they would escort them into wherever they were going to be speaking. And sometimes they would have a military band kind of escort them to make a lot of noise. Also, they would play, patriotic tunes. They were definitely attaching themselves to the flag and patriotism. And maybe the presence of those men, helped to protect them. But generally, they didn't get a lot of heckling. I do invent in the book an incident where, Ingeborg stops this dreadful plot of a anti-suffragist in Cleveland, or I think it was Columbus, Ohio, or someplace like that. So I kind of made that up, but there was definitely they did run across anti-suffrage sentiment, but at that point, no one seemed to be after them.
So there was nothing in Sarah's letters that would have suggested that?
No, I don't recall seeing anything like that. I mean, I think they may have been heckled a few times, but that would have been fairly standard.
No terrible danger then. Okay, good.
No, their danger was all from the road and just trying. I mean, there was one point when Sarah in Western New York gets thrown from the car, and they hit a pothole and break an axle, and she gets tossed out of the car. She survives, and they keep going, once they get the axle fixed, and that kind of thing. They were tough, these women. I'm here to tell you.
It sounds grueling. I just unmuted Cece. She has a question. Go ahead, Cece.
Yeah.
Greetings from Portland, Oregon, believe it or not. Yeah, this is just utterly fascinating. I'm actually a music historian and also a Lincoln Highway aficionado, and did a program on women's suffrage for music, virtually and in person when possible last year. Nice. And Russell, who is also on this Zoom call, was the one who sent me one of the articles about their trip And I actually used it in a live stream suffrage event we did in Oregon last week here, virtually. But my question for you, obviously, with all the music, I mean, Joe Hill wrote music. I've seen that. There's all these different things. But it's interesting how with women's suffrage and music, how that was used to not only boost morale, but to promote the cause. And we see the music change over time, right? Because musical styles change. And what I have been finding is that I keep finding new stuff. There's new songs because the research is just so buried. It isn't as highlighted as other moments in American history. So I really wanted to hear from you, not only because you had suffragists in your family, but also because of what you've seen. I was curious about songs, what they like to sing, what you had seen in your own research, and that kind of thing. Because I get those questions all the time with what I do as well. So yeah.
That's so cool. I'm so excited about your work. I mean, sometimes I have here in Maine, there's a group of women in harmony, they're called, and they were singing suffrage songs during the last year. And sometimes they would come and do some at my talks. And that was just so fun. Yeah, music was huge. I think in part because there was such a culture of church, going to church and singing hymns. But so they would adapt the hymns and reword, use the music, but change the words to suffrage songs and sometimes to popular tunes as well. I don't recall them. Actually, it's funny because there is an incident where I have them, sing songs to sort of warm themselves up, and I don't remember now which songs they were. I remember doing some research and pulling from some popular music and at the time. But and also I have another incident where they were singing "My Country 'Tis of Thee." That was a favorite of the suffragists, and I have Ingeborg, just because she gets a little snarky sometimes, singing to herself or imagining the words from the Little Red Songbook, the IWW songbook that Joe Hill wrote or somebody wrote about, just like changing the words, and it's much more, it's not that sort of glowing, beautiful scene of how wonderful our country is. It's more like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting squeezed.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, the Joe Hill IWW aspect is one that sometimes is hard to find stuff, sometimes not. So any of that stuff is just interesting and fascinating. So thank you. Yeah.
I mean, you can find those Little Red Songbooks online and find which ones he wrote. There was, I'm blanking on the name of it, but somebody wrote a biography of Joe Hill fairly recently, like within the last 5 years that I read. And he approaches it of trying to prove that Joe Hill was innocent and figure out who actually did that murder. And so that's quite an interesting book.
Cool. Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cece. Barbara just submitted a question through the chat box, so I'm going to read that and then I'll jump over to Pam. So Barbara says, this was another wonderful presentation, Anne. My question is, do we know if Maria and Ingeborg wanted to speak? Would they have been understood due to their accents? Do we know if they were offended due to not being asked to speak?
I think they were. I mean, I don't think Maria was. She was not an organizer, and I really, I kind of believe that. I mean, this is one of those things, like in my gut, I really believe that she was a big defender of women, and she, as a midwife, she certainly saw the effects of women not being able to control their, their fertility and choose when to have children. She certainly saw all of that. She herself grew up in a family where she had 3 siblings and but all different fathers. I mean, I think her mother was probably a prostitute, or that's how she survived, was sleeping with men, and so she'd had a very tough life, and so she knew how hard it was for women. But she wasn't the kind of person who liked to stand on the stage and speak. Ingeborg, now, she was, and she was definitely offended. And both Mabel and Sarah talk about that in their oral interviews, and Sarah does in her letters. But Mabel was really skillful, I think, at keeping Ingeborg's grumpiness or, natural irritation kind of in check, and giving her a lot of praise for everything they did. But honestly, I don't know. I mean, they lived in this country for 20 years or longer than that. I think Ingeborg came in 1890 and Maria had come in 1885, I think. So they'd been in the US for a long time. They had to deal with a lot of different people. So they had to speak language other than Swedish. I mean, I think they could have made themselves understood. And honestly, they had a great story, right? I mean, they're up by the bootstraps kind of people. Both of them came to the country with nothing. They never married. They relied on their own wits and strong backs and strong hands. And what a great story. Isn't that the kind of people we want in this country? But that's not what they wanted to highlight from the stump.
Well, we're glad you're telling their story now, Anne.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead. Pam, I've asked to unmute you, so you can go ahead.
All right. So hi, Anne. So as it happens, Anne's great grandmother and my grandmother were suffragists together. They actually did a lot of work together. This particular book is on different time and different group of suffragists, and it's fascinating. Thank you. It was a really excellent presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I also wanted to mention to Cece that my grandmother came from Portland, Oregon. Her name is Betty Graham Swing, and she was nicknamed the singing suffragist. She loved to start her speeches with singing songs that they sang in prison. And if you give me your email or something, I can email you some of the songs that I know for a fact that she sang, and the women that were in jail with her also sang. So if you put it in the chat or something like that. But I have a vague memory, and it's probably some other trip with petitions, of a petition getting lost. Do you know anything about that, Anne?
Well, yes. I mean, and I do talk about that in the book. I mean, in the research, like I was able to get all of the correspondence from the Congressional Union shipped up to the Portland Library on microfilm. So I read all of the correspondence that was going back and forth leading up to the trip and during it. And so one of the things you see is that suddenly there's letters going back and forth from Mabel saying, hey, where are those petitions? They're in like somewhere in the middle of the country, Kansas or someplace. And it's like, do you have them out there in San Francisco? No, we don't have them. We don't know where they are. But I think there must be in DC, back with headquarters, and headquarters doesn't have them either. But suddenly reporters, it's a monster petition, right? I mean, they want to see this monster petition. Sometimes they say it's like a mile or two long. I mean, right. I want to see a petition that looked like that, but they don't have it. So they come up with a bunch of different stories. I mean, sometimes they say, oh, well, we shipped it on ahead because it was raining and the train, company lost it. Or one time they said, yeah, well, they lost it, but we had a duplicate, so we're okay. It's like, that's bullshit. I don't believe it. You didn't have a duplicate of 500,000 names on a petition. I don't believe that. So I think actually, I don't know. I think they made up that number. I don't think they ever had that number or knew how many they had. And they ended up pulling off this stunt with it, much to their credit. I feel like they got stiff-armed so many times by congressmen who said, sure, I'll vote for your measure, and then didn't. So I feel like if they got to pull that one off, more power to them.
Yeah.
But that's great memories of your. I'm so glad you're here, Pam, to talk about Betty Graham Swing, because she was musical.
Yes, she wanted to be a professional singer, and instead she spontaneously decided to go join the suffrage movement and spent 3 years working full time for it. So. Yeah, and she would go and stay with Anne's great grandmother in Maine.
Yeah, that's right. They did. They actually canvassed the legislature together at one point, collecting signatures on a petition.
I love the connections we have here tonight. This is great.
Yeah.
Coincidental and otherwise. This is awesome. I wanted to jump in. Pam, did you have anything else that you wanted to say before?
That's it.
All right. Thank you so much. I wanted to real quick ask another question. So I was thinking about the trip and how you were saying that they were, having these treacherous road conditions. And I'm just trying to envision this whole experience. I mean, were they able to get from town to town in one day, or would there be long stretches where they'd have to camp? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they never did camp. They were always able to stay somewhere. In the West, there was much more kind of rudimentary infrastructure. They really weren't set up for motorists. There's one incident when they're coming through that Great Basin in eastern Nevada, and to me, I always think of it as Amelia Earhart has to hit that one island in the Pacific. In their case, they had to hit this farmhouse, this ranch house in the middle of hundreds of miles of empty desert, and they don't make it. They get lost. They have a man driving them. That's the famous incident where the man actually did get them lost. In his defense, there was nobody to ask for directions, at least not until they find these cowboys rolled up in blankets at a crossroads. So, but yeah, I mean, and they were going long distances. I mean, 120 miles a day, that can be a long way on really tough roads. And sometimes it was shorter than that. And in the East, the roads would be better. The cities were closer together. The weather was worse. But they didn't camp. They were able to stay someplace. And I think in the West, especially, the hotels were kind of buggy and nasty. By the time they got to, if they got to the big cities, they stayed in nice hotels.
I imagine. Yeah, I mean, I just trying to envision it. When we drive now, there's a gas station, every few miles, a McDonald's every few miles. I'm just envisioning long stretches with no gas stations because, cars are new and no mechanics and just having to rely on their own wherewithal. So you had mentioned that, was it Ingeborg who was the mechanic? Did they have previous experience with a car? Just out of curiosity, did they own one prior to this?
Yeah, they had. Maria had started using a car. She had a used car in Providence, and they sold it before they left and bought this new one. And Ingeborg had maintained it. She was very handy. I mean, so she actually built things. She maintained her Maria's house. Maria, she was like frugal and good with money. Ingeborg, not so much. And so it was really Maria who kind of kept them together financially. But Ingeborg, she maintained the car. She could fix things fix things around the house. She was quite handy. So yeah, she changed a dozen tires or more coming across the country and fixed other problems. She just sort of maintained it. Occasionally when it was things like the axle breaking or something like that, they had to get some help. But for the most part, she did it all.
That's so impressive. That's so impressive.
I know.
Oh, goodness. Well, we are at 7:30 now, right on the dot. So it looks like I think we're all done with our questions. And I just want to thank you again. This has been such a great presentation. And I'm excited to tell people about this book and to share this, this recording more, because obviously people need to know this story. And can you talk a little bit about, real quick, for folks who might be watching the recording, where they can find your book?
Yeah, let's see. You can get it at on Amazon for if you like to work with Amazon, but you can also get it from Main Authors Publishing. Both that and my first book, and my first book is also on Amazon. This book has a Kindle version of it. My other one doesn't. So if that's on both sites, I think. But that's, or you can order it through your local library, which is obviously a lovely way to do it.
Yes, we've got a copy. So we just ordered one, so we're good. Actually, real quick, also, if anyone's interested in autographed copies, because that's one of the things that now we're not doing these live events quite yet. Can they order it through your website at all, or?
Yeah, they should get in touch with me. I can put my email in the chat. I actually have a bunch of books at home, so I can send those along.
Oh, super. Okay. So yes, it's Gass, AGASSMAINE @gmail.com, in case people are watching the recording. Thank you so much, Anne. This has been very interesting. And thank you to everyone who showed up tonight with your wonderful questions and your wonderful insight. This has been a really special night. Thank you so much. Please join us again for future programs. You can find out all the good things happening at librarycamden.org. Even you folks all the way across the country, you are welcome to join us anytime. Have a good evening. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.